Okay, so I think we'll get going. So good morning, everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all here today. Before we start this morning's proceedings, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples and presently subject to Treaties 6, 7 and 8. Though our guests come from around the province today, we are hosting this event on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting grounds, gathering place and travelling route to Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene and Nakota Sioux. We also acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. This land has been a gathering place for many millennia. It has a long history as a place of learning and exchange. As an organisation, ECVO is grateful to have a public platform through which we can continue promoting learning, collaboration and the exchange of information for the betterment of our communities here on Treaty 6. I would also like to acknowledge that today, September 30th, is Orange Shirt Day, where we recognise the harm that residential schools inflicted on Indigenous communities and honour those impacted. We join together in the spirit of reconciliation and hope. So I just want to let everybody know that we'll be recording today's session and we'll be sharing this with all participants following the webinar. We will strive to monitor the chat box as we go through, and there should be opportunities to ask questions along the way. But we'll definitely make time towards the end for any Q&A. So if you have a question, please just throw it into the chat box there. We recommend that you choose speaker view for the best experience for this webinar. And I just want to introduce both the panelists that we're very lucky to have here with us today, as well as a little bit of an intro to the session. So the session is going to look at, as levels of government look to recover from COVID-19, there's significant impacts to political agendas and priorities. So our sector here will need to understand what these changes will mean for organisations and how to be nimble and act accordingly. So today we are joined by Edmonton team members from Global Public Affairs, Ilan MacDonald and Jonathan Sumamo. Sorry, Jonathan. So I'm going to introduce Ilan first. Ilan advises CEOs and senior leadership teams, leads strategic planning exchanges, resolves communications issues and crises, directs stakeholder engagement and builds advocacy strategies. She has more than 20 years of experience working with the Alberta Legislature, where she's served as Deputy Chief of Staff to former Premier Ed Stelmach and advisor to Premier Alison Redford, in addition to serving various cabinet ministers. She offers a unique perspective among government relations professionals, one that is firmly grounded in the Alberta experience and the result of more than 20 years working as an executive in political, private sector and community stakeholder relations roles. So welcome, Ilan. And Jonathan has more than 10 years experience in communications and public relations consulting, having worked in several provincial ministries with Public Affairs Bureau and at the Legislative Assembly of Alberta. He is a skilled crisis communications and strategic planning advisor. During his time with the Public Affairs Bureau, he dealt with a number of high-profile public relations issues and crises, including working in the Emergency Operations Centre during the High River floods. In the legislature, Jonathan has served as press secretary and most recently as senior communications consultant with the Progressive Conservative Caucus. As a former journalist working in both print and radio and in a number of different communities, he has tremendous amounts of experience in messaging to targeted audiences in an engaging and strategic manner. So I'm sure that you'll both join me in welcoming these two very experienced, seasoned professionals to walk us through what poses to be a very engaging webinar. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And a sincere thank you to everybody for joining us today. It's great to see so many. And, you know, there's a great deal of interest today on this topic, of course. And I know many organizations are internally gathering to talk about government relations and what it looks like today with COVID, and then, of course, what it might look like in the new reality post-COVID, whenever that might be. So today we're going to take a look at engagement in this new reality. And we're going to apply a nonprofit lens to the discussion as well, to the extent that we're able. What I'll say to you is please engage throughout, and it'll be more dynamic and interesting for you, and versus us droning on for an hour and a half. So we'll do our best to see your questions pop up in the chat. If we don't see you because we are focused on our notes, Fallon will try to watch them as well and jump in with your question. So I'll encourage you, please don't feel like you need to wait to the end. We'll keep this as dynamic as possible and relevant to you. So thank you for doing that for us. So just a couple of opening comments. The global pandemic has resulted in significant changes, of course, to how organizations operate and conduct their business. The same is true, of course, for government, and has introduced new barriers and challenges for groups like yourself as well. At our firm in Global Public Affairs, we've certainly seen the evolution of government engagement throughout the COVID pandemic. Certainly in the beginning when COVID peaked to today when we're starting to look at sort of what's next. I have to say, I think this might be the highest volume that I've seen government operate at in my history. And I started in '94 in government. The government's initial response to the COVID crisis, and then today to responding to stakeholders and others trying to figure out, how they can survive, how they can keep their employees working, how we can protect some of the most vulnerable during this time. And so I don't think I've ever seen government as busy. But having said that, I don't think I've also seen government as open to engagement. And we'll get into sort of how to do that and some of our experiences in terms of what's worked well and perhaps what hasn't. And we can talk about that at length throughout this presentation. So we'll share with you our experiences, and at both levels of government, federal and provincial. We can talk about municipal. It's not part of our formal presentation, but certainly, we've done work in that space. So if you have questions with respect to that, please feel free to put them in. And so we'll also talk about who the decision makers are, who their influencers are, what the right timing might be to engage, and what are some of the milestones in terms of timelines to watch for. Next slide, Yanni. So with that, you've already kind of heard who we are. I'll just maybe add to it a little bit. I have worked in and around Alberta politics my whole career. This, as I mentioned, starting in '94, almost exclusively at the provincial government level, but I have done government relations for different organizations along the way, whether they be public sector or private sector. And then about a decade ago, I started my own public relations firm called Impact Consulting, which 2 years ago, I merged with Global Public Affairs. So I've got a lot of experience working with all sectors, and in particular at the provincial government level. So hopefully I can share some of that experience and expertise with you today. And Yanni, over to you, please.
Sure, just a really quick introduction on my. I've been with Align for about 3 years, working with her team with a focus on provincial engagements and also strategic communications as well too. Like Gemma said, my background is in strategic communications from the legislature, where we sat on the other side of the table from stakeholders looking to engage, and just had a really great understanding of how effective key messages land and have a greater impact with your target audiences too. So really looking forward to today's discussion. Oh, and Alana, I think you're still on mute.
Sorry, thanks, Yoni. Had to happen once, probably happened again. So quick intro on global public affairs. Maybe next slide, Yoni, if you have a second. So there's 80 of us across 8 physical locations across Canada. And we are a integrated firm, which essentially means that we offer integrated services from government relations to media training and media relations to stakeholder engagement, crisis comms, and issues management. And so we're a full service firm is probably the best way to explain it. And we offer government relations services at all 3 levels of government. We have a really diverse group of individuals across the country. They come from all sorts of backgrounds and ideologies and experiences inside government and at the political levels. So really proud of the team across the country. you get us today, but a lot of what we'll share in particular from the federal perspective comes from our federal team. Over to you, Yanni.
Great. Okay, so let's frame the discussion for today and take a moment to set the stage for what we're going to be covering in this new reality of engagement. So as our world collectively changed in March of this year, it was clear fairly quickly that the global pandemic was going to have a lasting effect on our daily lives, as well as how we do business and operate. We saw municipal, provincial, and federal governments begin to consider a variation of an approach that we call respond, rebuild, and reimagine. Of course, where each government is in this process varies. Some governments have released their rebuilding strategy that sets the stage for the reimagining of programs and services and service delivery, while others are just beginning to have that rebuilding conversation as they move forward out of that immediate response. So regardless of where they are in that process, it's clear that they are coming to a similar end conclusion, that it's time for governments to reimagine how they approach their work and deliver services in a post-pandemic world. It's also important to note that, like I mentioned, while a lot of these rebuild strategies are in different places, they impact multiple spheres. So that could include infrastructure, economic diversification, like we've heard both the province and federal governments talk a lot about, but it also impacts profits in that civil society's sector as well too. So for today's discussion, I just wanted to take a quick moment to outline our objectives for the morning. So we've broken down the webinar into different pillars that will give you a sense of the current political lay of the land, some government relations engagement 101, and really importantly, focusing your priorities. Over the course of this discussion, you'll get a better understanding of the priorities of the different levels of governments, learn more on appropriate language for key message development to identify alignment and shared goals with your target audiences. Like I mentioned, that's one of my personal favorites and interests. And we'll also learn more about acting as an ambassador for your organization, as well as some action items you can begin immediately to affect and impact change in your advocacy efforts. Like Alan mentioned, for today's discussion, we really want to take a very conversational approach to this. This session is much more interesting and engaging when it's a two-way dialogue and not just Alan and I speaking at you for the next couple of hours. So feel free to enter any questions in the chat box. Alan and I will have a close eye on that. And we definitely carved out some time at the end of this discussion for a bit of a Q&A. If there is some detailed issues, or if we feel like there may need to be a longer discussion, Alan and I will provide our email addresses at the end of this conversation as well too, where we encourage you to reach out and we can continue to have that conversation offline. So back to you, Alan.
Super, thanks, Yanni. So we're going to dive in with the environmental scans. And so we'll talk a little bit about the government and political lay of the land, both at the federal and provincial level. Again, jump in with questions. So we'll start with sort of how we structured these environmental scans. We're going to talk about how we got here, so which includes the government's initial reaction to COVID, as well as actions that they took in response to the pandemic and their pandemic recovery plans. We'll talk about important dates and timelines on the horizon that you should be aware of, as well as we'll sort of conclude it with advice and counsel on how to take the right approach at the various levels of government to engage. So with respect to Ottawa, so during the pandemic, the Trudeau government has been, I think, effectively a minority government in name only. The opposition parties largely supported the COVID response. They worked quite collaboratively together, as was necessary, of course, in the early days of the pandemic, and trying to understand the scope and extent of it and what was going to be required from a health perspective. I'd say the federal government moved very quickly on making decisions around supports. Some of the money, you could argue, didn't flow as quickly as folks would have liked, but the decisions made were relatively swift. The province and the municipalities, I think, were also good partners. Even in Alberta, where of course we've had some difficulties and a bit of an acrimonious relationship with the federal government, that was placed to the side. in the early days of the pandemic, and of course, which was very, very necessary. I think in the recent months, obviously the Conservatives were preoccupied with the leadership race, so that has taken them a bit out of the conversation. And it's early days with Aaron O'Toole, so it kind of remains to be seen what kind of position he's going to take. Interesting that he's given a disproportionate number of his shadow cabinet appointments to the West. Certainly Alberta is strongly represented in his shadow cabinet, and he has spoken at great length about Alberta and notions around Western alienation and the need to support our oil and gas sector. But again, just back to the Trudeau government, I think for the most part, and I think the polls reflect it, that there's been general support for the way that they've handled the COVID pandemic. And then in recent months, and certainly we saw it in the throne speech, they have started to shift their message from crisis response to the economic rebuild in the economy. It's been paused a little bit, and it's gotten a little bit confusing in the last week or so as we've watched the COVID numbers increase exponentially in Quebec and Ontario. So, obviously we'll need to watch that closely. But Minister Catherine McKenna, Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, and of course Chrystia Freeland have led sort of the next phase of the conversation around economic recovery and sort of the place of each province in that economic recovery. And of course, Chrystia Freeland is a very important player when it comes to Alberta. And we'll get into that a little bit more later on in the presentation. Of course, we had the federal throne speech, and it was, again, a pivot to the recovery plan, which is very focused on the green economy, which aligns with the election platform of the Trudeau government. So they, too, are trying to pivot back to pre-COVID agendas and pre-COVID messaging to the extent that they're able to. And it's a little bit vague on detail, which often these types of announcements are during a throne speech, and more details to come with respect to the green economy and other components of the throne speech. Generally, the government laid out a plan to, I think their terms were bailing out the boat through a lot of investment. And, there's a lot of opportunity for access to federal funding. How you do that is a conversation that we'll get to in a couple of slides. Next slide. So on the theme of sort of the Alberta response to the federal throne speech and the federal agenda, as a speech focused very much on the green energy and an energy transition, there was, as expected, sort of a strong and swift reaction from the Alberta government. And, Premier Kenney was very quick to point out that there's a lot of funding commitments in the federal plan, and they are not going to be possible without a strong Alberta economy. And that means a strong energy and resource sector. Premier's comments were also around this notion that the throne speech should unify, and from his perspective, it made Alberta provinces feel sort of further Western alienation feelings. And Premier Kenney committed to working with supportive premiers to continue to sort of take on Ottawa as he tries to continue to play a coalition leadership role. And we saw some of that work, I think, this past week with the Council of the Federation meetings. So how does the throne speech and Alberta's response affect you on the call? Obviously early days and a lot remains to be seen, but I think a couple of important points. One, the period of collaboration that was necessary during the early days of COVID is likely over, and we are going to return back to a more of an acrimonious relationship with Ottawa. So, while Ottawa and Alberta were able to get together and push out some of the supports during the COVID times, we think that cooperation is going to be halted. And so I think a couple of thoughts on that. So what do you do when you're sitting in Alberta and you need federal government support and you also need provincial government support, and you feel quite pulled and conflicted? A couple of things I would say. We've seen over the last couple of weeks with respect to the throne speech that the federal Liberals have needed the support of the NDs and have received the support of the NDs. So there's an opportunity there to make sure that we are heard, not only with the Liberal government, but also with the NDs. And of course, we have one local representative who's very familiar with your sector and has been an advocate for your sector. And so, finding ways to tap into that and getting her to help take the message to Ottawa is important. The other thing that I think is important is the role of municipalities. And in the early days of the Kenney administration, he's a strong federalist, and so the role of the municipal government and the federal government are very important to the Kenney administration, which means the municipalities are a product of the provinces and therefore shouldn't have a direct relationship with the federal government. And so we have seen in the early days pre-COVID, the provincial government here in Alberta really try to position that they need to be the ones negotiating directly with the federal government, and the municipalities need to work through the provinces. The federal government, of course, has not wanted to abide by that and have worked very hard, and I would say quite successfully, to build relationships directly with municipalities. And I would say Alberta municipalities in particular, the two big ones, are no exception. And the personal relationships that the two large mayors have with people like Chrystia Freeland should not be underestimated. And I think there's a real opportunity there for them to be advocates for the folks on this call as well. I'm just going to pause and ask if there's any questions or comments at this point. And feel free to disagree, feel free to challenge ideas or ask questions. You guys are a quiet bunch so far. So much easier in person when we get the direct feedback and ability to engage. So I think that's probably where I'll pause. I don't see any questions, Yanni, and I'll turn it back to you.
Sure, thanks for that. So, so with that in mind, we'll take a look at what's on the federal horizon over the sort of the next 30, 60, 90 days to take us to the end of 2020. So we've seen the fiscal framework in really uncharted territory. We're seeing record spending from the federal governments with the absence of a 2020 budget because of the pandemic. And like Alan mentioned, the importance of Chrystia Freeland. So just a bit of a deeper dive on her background. She is facing a very daunting task. She not only takes on the office of the finance minister after her predecessor, Bill Morneau left amid some of the weed charity scandal allegations, but she also has the daunting task of how to pay for the throne speech commitments, as well as some of that Western unification. Her roots are based in Western Canada, so she's seen as someone who's able to speak to some of those very vocal premiers out west that may not be happy with the leader and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So some engagement opportunities that we want to get on the team's radar. Parliament is resumed sitting, so they are back in session, which always presents a great time to connect with your MPs or ministers. And a new federal budget will be tabled as well too. So we'll take a deeper dive on budgets, pre-budget engagements and submissions on that front. Like Alan said, during the peak of the pandemic, it was we saw a time of very visible cooperation between Ottawa and the provinces, like we've never seen before. Premiers Kenney leading the way. We're working with the Prime Minister's office, but now that we've seen the throne speech and Kenney's very vocal response, it's an important question to ask: what's next? The Fair Deal panel, which the province did kick off, was a major issue leading into the pandemic, but was really pushed to the back burner when governments were cooperating together to pull together an initial COVID pandemic response. Members of the Alberta caucus were very adamant in bringing forward those recommendations from the Fair Deal panel. So expect some of that taking on Ottawa rhetoric to really ramping up over the next little while. We'll take a deeper look on that in our provincial outlook as well too.
Donnie, I'm just going to check. So there's a couple of questions stemming, I think, mostly from my earlier comments. And the one question is around, what do you mean saying that Premier Kenney is a strong federalist? And really what I was referring to is this sort of the system of division of powers that he a strong national government and then strong regional governments that work in collaboration and cooperation. And all of that, of course, is grounded in our Constitution. And so the Premier is a strong believer in the system of federalism. And so within that, though, municipalities are the creation of the provinces. And so, so he strongly believes in that. And when you couple that with the notion of, one taxpayer, you can see why, sort of with his ideological sort of view of the world, that he sees municipalities as importantly being sort of accountable to the province, and sort of wanting to kind of control that relationship. I'm not sure I'm articulating it well, but hopefully that gets it across. With respect to, there's another question around, can you speak more about how the We Charity scandal has affected the sector and how we can build back transparency and trust with the public? I think that is an excellent question, and we might want to see if we can actually create a bit of an open discussion towards the end on that, because I'd be really curious from your perspectives how you feel it is impacting you and some of the things that you're already doing to counter it. It was interesting to me that the We scandal, just from a government perspective and a government relations perspective, really had a very limited impact on the Trudeau administration. When you look at the polling fall, yes, there was a bit of a dip, but it's not going to cost the Liberals an election. That to me was interesting for lots of reasons, but it really hasn't, which is why I think there was a lot of folks that were thinking the federal government would try to push for an election this fall, because they, likelihood would have ended up or could end up with a majority administration. But I do think that the scandal has impacted your sector, no doubt about it. It's, obviously forever impacted We Charity. So I think there does need to be something that the sector does in response to rebuild trust. And I guess what that looks like, we can have maybe a broader conversation, but I agree with you that something should be done. Maybe I'll just leave it there for now.
And Ellen, I'll just quickly jump in on that too. In terms of how to build transparency and trust with the public, we will definitely dive into that as well too, because I think the common perception was that they were, the group was just too tied into one specific party and had, all of their eggs in one basket. And we'll talk a little bit about how to build relationships with parties across the political spectrum. And I think that's a great way to build transparency and trust with the public, where there won't be any perception about, you're a liberal charity or a conservative charity. You would just be a charity or nonprofit that would be able to work with the government of the day. So we do have a section carved out, and I think it's a really great question, and we'll take a deeper dive on that when we talk about how to effectively engage with opposition, engage with parties across the aisle as well too.
Yanni, just unmute.
Sorry. Right. And we'll continue on with the federal approach. So typically in the past, when it came to engagement with the federal government, especially with organizations out west, you could do things such as a lobby day where your executive team or board of directors would actually head to Ottawa, set up a number of meetings with ministers and key staff, usually centered around a certain event or function, and you could push forward on your agenda or priorities. Because of the current situation that we're facing, there's no solid grasp on when we'll get back to a time where lobby days will be, exist and organizations will be able to do that. But that doesn't mean engagement opportunities are no longer present. We've definitely seen over the past few months that opportunities for engagement are abound. Ministers and MPs across the political spectrum are interested in virtual roundtables with their senior officials or virtual meetings where you can get some of that face-to-face contact, where it may not be physical, but you can still get some of those discussions in with ministerial offices. But you cannot engage in typical fashion where you might be able to catch your local MP at an event or minister on a barbecue or cocktail circuit. Federal decision makers have been fairly accessible via these virtual roundtables or meetings. And as you're reaching out for some of these virtual engagements, especially from a nonprofit perspective, heading into some of these key decisions regarding the federal budget, it's important to understand where government focus is. Spending is overextended, like we said. A number of expensive promises were made in the throne speech, and you're competing for airtime with their focus on pandemic recovery and a continued focus on relief. So that means now more than ever, you'll need to align messaging with government's priorities to get traction. And we will have more on that to talk about how to frame your messaging, frame your priorities to ensure that it lands with your target audiences. But simply put, while the government in Ottawa is highly accessible and geared towards providing relief, there's major competition for federal support right now from all sectors of the economy. I do see some questions too, so let's pause and have a look at that as well too. So first one is, how do you suggest we approach provincial advocacy for sector supports when the majority of the COVID response funding has come from the feds? How do we advocate for provincial investment as well when the provinces have generally been happy to wait for federal funding? It's hard to get the attention of provincial governments in sector supports. I think it's a really, really great question. I think it's something that we've talked about. I know Alana and I have just recently chatted about that as well too. Alana, I know it's ahead of our notes, but I think it's a great time to address that question now. If you wanted to talk a bit about how federal and provincial governments are splitting up funding and some of the intel we've been getting from the province saying how best to access that funding from the feds first.
Mm-hmm. You're right. So Brenda, great question. I think you're right that the province has taken the approach of seeing what the federal government will produce first. And in fact, we know that that's their preference. So to the extent that you're able to, we should try to get the federal funding first and then leverage it to have the province add to it. It's their preferred approach, and to try to sort of do it reverse is a bit of a noodle up the hill. So I understand that it is hard to do it in reverse because they really don't want to. In cases like childcare, housing, there might actually be an opportunity to do it that way, right? Where you can actually approach the feds and achieve the federal funding first. They don't seem as hung up about being first to the table. So maybe just try to leverage that, to be frank. I think there are other things, and I'm going to jump ahead of my notes. So I'm probably going to mess myself up a bit, so forgive me if I end up being redundant. But with respect to how do you get attention of the provincial government relative to sector supports? I think there's a number of tactics that you could utilize as a sector. When I look, so I sit on the chamber board, and one of the things that we did as a chamber was in the summer months pulled together an economic recovery task force. And so we brought in groups from, and it was a business focus because it's a chamber, but we brought in our a number of shareholders from a bunch of different sectors, but the focus was on how to get businesses back to work and how to help them create jobs. And we put together a report, and it's not public yet, but at some point it will be, that will make recommendations to all levels of government. In the same vein, the community colleges came together, and they've released one grouping of the recommendations. More will follow. But again, they put together a task force on economic recovery, and they took it upon themselves to come together and to hold a number of roundtables with their key stakeholders and come up with short and long-term recommendations that will be critical to the economic recovery of the college sector. So it's something for you guys to consider if you haven't done something like this already, and forgive me if you have and I just don't know it, but drive it yourselves, right? So come together, put together something, put pen to paper, have concrete, tangible asks, and you can make them to multiple levels of government and to the private sector if you think there's a role there for the private sector, which I would argue there is. And then once you have the recommendations, then it's about how to get it in front of the right people, right? Whether it's the Premier's Council on charities and civil society, if it's the regional caucuses, if it is your parliamentary assistant, like there's a couple of things that I would do to kind of have an advocacy push to then take those recommendations and push them. So just a couple of early thoughts and we can get into that. Brenda, I might just ask you specifically, and I'll just watch you in the chat if that answers your question, or if you have any other further questions. And in the meantime, I'm going to turn to a question from Michael. How do you respond to a government who states that federal funding support is also their support and uses it as justification not to provide additional funding? Yeah, I mean, I hear you. Yeah, I hear you. So it's sort of an excuse to vacate, right? Because the feds are already doing it, and they'll argue that it's part of the money that we send there. I hear you on that. I don't know that I have a great answer. I'll maybe think about that as we're proceeding and come back, Michael, in the question and answer part, and just see if I can give you some more concrete thoughts on that.
And Alana, I have a question just building off of that suggestion of, gathering recommendations or engagements and then providing to the province or feds. So you've mentioned a number of groups who've done that, like the Chamber and the colleges. Has the province been receptive of this form of engagement where they gather as a group and then provide one set of recommendations? Has it worked so far?
Yeah.
Just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I've seen it work. Now the Chamber hasn't done theirs yet, but with respect to the college, and it's public, so I'm not telling tales. The Minister of sorry, I'm just forgetting the new name of Jobs, Economy and Innovation, actually tweeted it out and thanked the task force for their recommendations. Said they were looking forward to working with the sector to implement them. So not only were they supportive, they were publicly supportive of it. And again, they didn't ask the sector to go out and do this. The sector took the initiative to do it themselves. So food for thought, guys. Okay. Yanni, you're good if I move on to response from Alberta? No.
Let's quickly move through the federal decision makers, because I did want to touch on the importance of opposition. So we did talk about cabinet changes and the importance of Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland. But I did want to talk about how right now the official opposition with their new leader and new focus has a refreshed shadow cabinet. And this is important for nonprofits to know, because using opposition can be fairly tricky. It can be very effective, but it also can backfire as well too. It is important, like I mentioned, to build those relationships with parties across the aisle. There was a question about the We Charity. One of their perceived downfalls was that they were very cozy with a specific party and no one else. And you don't want to be perceived as a conservative nonprofit or a liberal nonprofit. So it's great to build relationships with the opposition early. And understanding who is in those critic portfolios or that shadow cabinet portfolio. Informing the opposition of your advocacy efforts and agenda can be useful, but you need to be open and honest that you are sharing this info with the applicable minister's offices as well as your local MP who may be in opposition, which is the case for if you are located in Alberta or for the most part of Western Canada. But like I mentioned, it's really important to ensure that your issue is not used as a political football. You don't want it to be a headline that can embarrass the government with, because a great way to demonstrate that your issue or priority does not align with government is to have it embarrass them or used as, like I said, a political tool during question period.
And Yanni, just on that, if I could jump in, I think people really struggle with how to use the opposition, and in particular when you don't actually have representation from the governing party in your geographical area. So that's an issue for Alberta, obviously federally, but it's also an issue for Edmonton provincially. And so, my view has always been sort of twofold. One, everybody who's elected, regardless of political stripe, is there to represent the people and have sort of the right to be told the story, the same story as everybody else, right? So I think the key, though, is that as long as you are sharing the same story, so as long as your key messages, are the same key messages that you use with government. So you don't change the story or have a slightly different ask. You have the same ask, you share the same story, you're treating everybody fairly and in the same way, then you can minimize the trouble that you might get yourself into, right? So just a bit of a caution, but I think there's a lot of, as Yanni said, a lot of really effective ways to use the opposition, just to make sure primarily that they're informed. I think the other thing is always to be transparent. And so we've often cautioned or advised our clients to be really transparent. When you're talking to government, you can share that you've also shared this with other members of the Legislative Assembly or other members of Parliament, and that you're spreading your message far and wide. And it pulls the politics out when you do that, but just being transparent about it. Thanks, Yanni.
Sure, and just a few shadow cabinet members I do want to get on the team's radar. There is a critic for diversity, inclusion, and youth with Kenny Shu, and there's a critic for women and gender equity as well too, for which is Jake Sahota. So we talked about some of the government decision makers and target audiences, but those would be your opposition target audiences as well. So Alain, I'll throw it back to you to talk about the response from Alberta, and let's get a little closer to home.
Okay, super, thank you. So kind of to best understand how the province is moving forward in the rebuild and reimagine stages, I'm just going to reflect back a little bit on how we got here in the initial response stages. And before the pandemic hit, the province was moving forward very quickly through their election platform commitments. And I will say I have probably not seen a government more committed directly to what their platform said. People often ask me, how do you know where the government's going, or what do you think they think about this? And I said, if it's not on their election platform, they're not interested. And if it isn't, and really the point being that they are following very closely their election platform. And it was interesting, just prior to the pandemic hitting, in fact, I think it was about February, I was in a session where Minister Travis Taves, the Minister of Finance and Treasury Board provincially, was speaking, and he was commenting on, number one, how many of their platform commitments they had achieved. And at that point in time, I think it was around 45% in the first year and a half of governing. But also that they felt that their election platform was working. And so when he reflected on some measurements like the number of infrastructure new builds, drilling projects, number of new jobs, all of it was trending upward. And so he was pointing to that, saying, our economic recovery plan, that was not in response to COVID, but in response to the economic downturn, they believed was working. So then, of course, that was until the pandemic hit in March and completely derailed the province's agenda. Their platform that was focused almost exclusively on jobs in the economy and pipelines had to be put on the back burner. And they had to turn their attention, obviously, on how to navigate the really uncertain waters around COVID, in particular in the first 2 months. The government spent about $14 billion in COVID response programs and initiatives. And some of you on this call will have been part of these programs, whether it was support for homeless shelters, women's shelters, food banks, etc. They also put about $50 million into mental health supports for those struggling to cope throughout the pandemic. So they really turned their attention. And this created some fairly significant tension, I would say, across the province, and that was reflected in caucus. And so maybe it was around May, something like that, you started to see some tensions boil out of caucus, in particular from rural Alberta. And in most cases, it was sort of a reflection of what they were hearing in their constituencies. And there were, a number of folks, and we've all, read about it in the paper and heard it from maybe friends and relatives that live outside of some of the urban centers, that were questioning the COVID response. They felt that it was an overreaction, we were unnecessarily hurting the economy, and that we were just, and that this government in particular was being distracted from their agenda. And there's a cohort of, in particular, of the UCP party from rural Alberta that really believed strongly in the agenda that they sent the Premier to carry out around sort of getting Alberta's fair deal in the country, and sort of repositioning Alberta as a powerhouse and defending our energy sector. And they felt frustrated that all of this was put on the back burner, coupled with the fact that they were losing jobs. So the Premier in about May was faced with a real dilemma in trying to manage internal caucus politics while continuing to keep his eye on the obvious necessary ball of COVID. But it's why you saw, I think around the same time frame, the Premier come out with the Fair Deal Panel report. And I had a lot of people phone me that week and say, why in the middle of a pandemic would this be a priority for the government? And it was really in response to some of those tensions and dynamics within Rural Caucus. I think that's just important to know as we think through your advocacy strategy, because the importance and the influence of Rural Caucus is really important, and that hasn't let up. I think what happened back in May puts a fine point on it. When you look at the polls today, I'm sorry, Yanni, I'm totally off script, but when you look at the polls today, the popularity of the party and the Premier is falling in all three buckets of sort of the Edmonton, Calgary, and rural. And, we all know in Alberta that you need to win two of the three. And so, hanging on to rural is critical. I think we've got about 90% of the rural seats. So I just want to put a fine point on the importance of rural and the importance of some of the internal dynamics. And I've lost my place in my notes, so forgive me. I'll just right. And then obviously, so being derailed off their platform, but it also made them push back other priorities like action on civil societies. So all of that got pushed on the back burner. Yanni, the next slide, please. I'm just taking a peek at the questions. I'll just pause for a moment. Okay, Yanni, I'm going to let you look at those, and I'll just keep going for a moment.
Yeah, so you're on what's on the Alberta horizon with the lunch session and the recent fiscal updates.
Great, thanks for refocusing me. So a few items on the horizon that I wanted to briefly discuss. Two important updates came out late in the summer, one of them being the Economic Recovery Plan, and the other was the first quarter fiscal update. And as most of you will know, the Economic Recovery Plan is government's plan to support and kickstart the provincial economy following the pandemic. And it's clear to see that this government is now taking its first steps to return back to their platform agenda as well. They're focusing on job creation through this recovery plan, largely through new infrastructure spending, economic diversification, and increasing Alberta's competitiveness and opening itself to attract new investment. Their focus on diversification is really through sort of a six sector approach to drive diversification. And the six sectors are agriculture and forestry, tourism, technology and innovation, aviation and aerospace, fintech and finance, and then the creative industries. Work is already underway in most of those, well, I would say in all of those, but they are sort of timing the release of a strategy for each of those sectors. So, we'll start to see them roll. We've seen some of them roll out. We'll start to see others roll out. They have working groups that are occurring inside government. And so it's something that I would ask you if you've been engaged on that. And if not, we should spend a little bit of time talking to you about how you make sure that you're at the table. In the Economic Recovery Plan, government sort of reiterated its commitment to culture and growing Alberta's cultural industries by 25% to 1.5 billion in the next decade. And of course, the Alberta Film Tax Credit is a centerpiece of this goal. Of course, they also announced the redevelopment of the Glenbow Museum in Calgary, and introduced the cultural event relaunch program to help music and performing arts and others as they are trying to restart programming once the public health measures allow that. The fiscal update laid out obviously a really stark fiscal reality, and it is sort of the precursor to budget of 2021. It was a grim picture, as we all know, $25 billion in debt and nearing deficit and nearing $100 billion debt. And so, you know, the province reiterated the triple whammy impacting our province. You know, it wasn't just the pandemic, it was the economic downturn, and it was the fight in the energy sector with respect to oil and gas prices. And so the line that we all keep hearing is that there needs to be a fiscal reckoning. And, you know, we heard it again reiterated at the AUMA conference. You know, I think this is something that, you know, they're doing their best to foreshadow. You know, we all know and expect that there is going to be, you know, sort of a resetting of the fiscal agenda. And you'll recall back to the provincial election and the platform of the party, which was to be in balance by the time the next election rolled around. Obviously not going to happen, but I do think that the government is going to need and want to put forward a plan that shows that they can see a day in the future where a balanced budget is possible. And so, you know, I think we'll start to see some pretty tough messaging to get back to that path to balance. With respect to nonprofits, you know, I think the pre-budget engagement period is going to be really important. We're in it right now, and typically in a budget cycle, as many of you will already know this, you know, it starts in August with typically a cabinet retreat where they start thinking through what the priorities are, and they start to think about what the budget targets are going to be. By this time of the year, typically departments are given their budget targets. I don't know that has happened yet. I don't believe it has happened yet. I think the pandemic has pushed all of that down a little bit. But my point to all of you is that even if official pre-budget consultations haven't started, you're in the time frame when you should be engaging. And we can talk a little bit about how to do that. With the fall legislature returning mid-October, of course, they advanced that by a week because they have a significant legislative agenda. They're going to be in Edmonton, and they are going to have time to be engaging. And so, you know, that sort of just helps out in terms of your time to get in front of government. And while it's in the early stages of discussion, the Ministry of Culture is pulling together a plan and an approach for nonprofits to provide input into the recovery plan. Early stages, from what we understand, you might be privy to something more than we are with respect to that. But our understanding is that it's coming, but it hasn't come yet. So again, we can talk about that a little bit more.
Alain, I'll just pause you there for a few quick questions coming in. So just for everyone's update, Catherine had a great question on, you know, we've been throwing a number of names out there for decision makers. So how best to contact them. So following this discussion, we'll definitely circulate a document that just gives a breakdown of some of the key decision makers that we've mentioned and how best to reach them. So we'll circulate that afterwards. And Rob had a great question on non-media sources like mailing lists to stay on top of all things government and some of their key decisions. So Rob, you're jumping ahead. We definitely have some space carved out that to talk about some of the items that you can be using as well too. And then one question from Brenda just came in. Are you aware of any provinces that have effective collaboration in government with the nonprofit sector? I know Senate committee recommended a federal place for nonprofits sector in a ministry. Any provinces we can look to for an example?
I don't know the answer to that. Nothing jumps out, but what we can do, Brenda, is just reach out to our team across the country and just see if we can get you an informed answer on that. Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, Brenda. Okay, so jumping to, I just have a couple more slides and then I'll turn it back to Yanni. But on the economic recovery recovery plan. I've already talked about the sector approach. Sorry, I'm just getting my thoughts. Right. So I think we've actually already covered this with respect to the sector approach and where you might want to fit in. This was the slide where I was going to talk about this notion of pulling together your own table. And maybe it's a series of roundtables, maybe it's one larger one, maybe you invite government to them, or maybe it's something that you pull a report together. But I think what I would suggest is, as a sector, that you sort of start from where do you want to end up, which is, you know, probably a list of things that you want to put in front of the two levels of government in particular, and then figure out who you need to have at the table to help inform what that should look like, and then kind of build your structure to achieve that, whether it's roundtables, etc. And then from there, you know, really think through who you need to have that in front of, and build a bit of an advocacy strategy to make sure you get it in front of the right people. And what's really important is, you know, just be mindful of the time. If you haven't started something like this, you're a little behind the 8 ball. So you just gotta, you know, just get moving on it and make sure you get something into the respective governments relatively quickly. And by relatively quickly, I would say by the end of November, in order to influence the next round of budgets.
Great. And I'll pause you there for two really great questions that just came in. So one is on from Michael on the, you know, with all the talk of the pandemic and downturn, will this give the UCP more room to explore a sales tax or other revenue options? So this is a really timely conversation. I think a lot of groups are talking about a sales tax. If you're following the BC election, the BC Liberals just announced a major platform commitment to suspend the sales tax for a year and then reduce it significantly following that. So sales tax is definitely on the mind of provincial governments, especially with the UCP. When Finance Minister Travis Taves had the McKinnon Blue Ribbon panel reports released last September now, so about a year ago, there was a lot of talk on, you know, the fiscal reality that the province is facing, and he really framed it in a way as such where Alberta was facing a spending problem, not a revenue problem. Of course, since then, we have now, you know, discovered, especially with the last fiscal update, that we actually do in fact have a fiscal problem. But you know, when there was discussion on the fiscal challenges faced by Alberta, both the finance minister and premier were both really clear that they were going to put a PST or sales tax to a referendum, which is actually legislated. I believe it was by former Premier Klein, that any introduction of a sales tax in Alberta would have to pass a referendum vote. So they said that they would not change that legislation. If they were going to introduce a sales tax, it would have to be through a general referendum. Alan, is there anything you want to add on other diversification areas? I know the new Minister of Jobs, Economy and Innovation has been really busy over the past couple of weeks on other revenue streams and revenue options as well too. Anything you want to share on that?
So if I could just back up on the notion of a consumption tax, when the Premier was running for the leadership of the party, and then I think it was reiterated again during the election campaign, sort of how he was going to balance the books. The Premier often talked about increasing revenues by increasing our GDP. And, you know, he took the stance that, you know, if we diversified our economy, attracted more investment, we could, and I'll get the numbers wrong, but he would say we could grow the GDP by X%, which would equal so many dollars. And that was sort of how, you know, part of, in addition to some reduction in expenditures, sort of the path to balance. The challenge now is that, there's challenges in growing our economy, obviously, with respect to COVID. So I think the pandemic has made that even more difficult than it would have been, coming out of an economic downturn and having the hit to our oil and gas sector. So so I would say that, he didn't favor the notion of additional taxation, in particular consumption tax, as part of the solution. When he's been asked about it, he's been explicit that it's not in the books, it's not in his plans, but if folks want to see that he would then put it to the people. I think we're going to continue to hear pressure from various sectors or segments of the population that want at least the notion of a consumption tax to be studied. And it might be that that's as far as, this government might go, is to commit to studying it further. So I would say that's probably it on a consumption tax. With respect to, sorry, what was your other question, Yanni?
It was on diversification and other revenue streams.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think Invest Alberta is going to be a critical entity, and part of it is, their plan is to go out and be really targeted in their approach to attracting new foreign direct investment to our province, and it will be connected to the diversification strategy, so connected to the sector approach. But again, that's very, very early days in that regard.
Okay.
Okay.
Just a few more questions on here as well too. Rumors circulating about the provincial government wanting nonprofits to consolidate whenever possible. Any thoughts on that? So I'll kick it off, Alana, and then throw it to you. Just a note on consolidation. I'm sure everyone knows about the red tape associate minister, and consolidation has been a hot topic for a lot of sectors. So it's not just with the nonprofit group, but also for folks like municipalities, post-secondaries are also having that conversation as well too. In early days, government was talking about consolidation where possible, if it makes sense and is will lead to red tape reduction. Stemming from that conversation, they were clear that they weren't going to mandate or tell anyone to consolidate. But that was early discussions. Anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I would just say, certainly heard it a lot as well. And to Yanni's point, it's in a number of different sectors. I think what I have heard the most from the government is that, the intention isn't to direct anybody, but perhaps compel, just by challenging people to think things through a little bit differently. But I haven't heard anything that suggests that they're going to force amalgamation on any front for any sector. No, that's just what I've heard, and it it sort of goes against, I think, this government's approach in general, right? They're not they haven't done that yet. They've tried to negotiate and they've tried to create the conditions for certain things, but they haven't forced it. So again, I think if there's a vision that the sector has for for an alternative or for consolidating maybe aspects like, the back end of the business or something like that, then I think, there's an opportunity for you to drive that conversation. Okay.
And then just one more question before we move on, but Alberta government's integration with and consultation of the voters and stakeholders has been severely limited. These limitations have been put in place either by the scope of the quote-unquote survey and the questions asked, or by limiting the participation to those who are specifically identified or invited. How do you monitor or deal with this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I would actually say I've heard this come up with probably every administration, in the last 15 years, that it, sometimes feels like consultations are sort of cooked, that there's a desired outcome that they're working towards. And I think, that's always a challenge, right? When you're trying to move policy forward. I would say, and I'll probably sound like a bit of a broken record, but I would take it in your own hands and, create a compelling cohort, like, so a critical number of voices to get your ideas put forward. So participate in the survey, because I think they do matter. I mean, there is a public service that is taking a look at what comes back. I think it's important to participate, but if they're not asking the questions in a way that you think should be asked, or you think they're misleading, or you think that they're missing a piece of it, then I think you have to, find another path to get your voice heard and your recommendations put in front of them. And that is just creating your own platform to do that.
Great. Okay, let's park a few questions for a moment, and then we will move on to approaching the province, and I'll let you carry on from this slide.
Sorry, and maybe I'll just go back a little. Sorry, I just want to finish. I have another thought on that question is, I think there's also ways to use maybe non-traditional partners. And, I have a bit of a bias because I sit on the board of Edmonton Global, but, our whole role as an organization is to help attract new investment to the region. And when you talk to CEOs about, what are some of the critical pieces that they look at before making a decision to locate, there's a number of pieces, and a lot of it has to do with quality of life and how we treat our most vulnerable, and access to cultural opportunities. And so, I think there's a direct government approach, but I also think there's another way to expand your advocates out there, and using some maybe non-traditional partners. Okay, you probably want me to get through this slides, don't you, Yanni? I'll focus. Okay, so the next one is around approaching the province. So we've touched some of this obviously already. So the recovery plan is fairly high level. I would call it sort of a foundational piece, or setting the stage. And, sort of the analogy is building a house, and this would be the foundation. Everything I've heard from folks inside the government is that they are still eager and open to engaging with stakeholders to flesh out the details of the recovery plan. And they're looking for help, and they're looking for support, and they're looking for partners. So I think it, in some ways the sectoral approach will make it somewhat easy to do that. And you just got to find a way to be creative to align your objectives with one of those sectors, or one or more of those sectors. I'd say if you feel like you don't fit into those sectors, there's other approaches, but I suspect just looking at how broad those sectors are, there's a way to fit into them. Yeah, and I guess the other piece of it, with aligning is finding language that will resonate, right? So it's finding a way to align with the government's agenda. And as we've said before, they are not veering off their agenda, right? Whether it's the platform, it will be the same with their economic recovery plan. It's the way they operate. So find a way to fit in their agenda, and use language that they'll understand and that they're using, to the extent that you're able to, of course. And, don't be afraid to kind of go back a little bit to some of their earlier pieces, because they all tie and weave into each other. So whether it's the blueprint for jobs, which came out during the last budget, and that's actually a really good document in terms of its general focus on jobs and quality of life. So I think, in particular for this group, if you haven't read the Blueprint for Jobs, I'd go back and take a look at that and see if you can't utilize some of the language. I think it's worth noting also the Premier's Council on Economic Recovery, headed by Jack Mintz. This group has done just very limited engagement with folks, but there has been some. They're not going to produce a report, as we all know, but their advice is sort of ongoing. They tend to not be putting forward their own ideas, but responding to ideas that the government has. So the council's view has generally been, the better informed we are, the better our advice will be to government. And so while you may not get an audience with them, they will read. So getting them a document, or getting them some recommendations, or getting them your feedback on something the government is trying to move forward, I think would probably be a good use of your time.
And I'm just looking at the clock. I think I'll move us on to provincial decision makers, so we can move on to a bit of that GR 101 and framing the messages. So I'll move us through the next slide fairly quickly, but just wanted to talk, we talked about some of the federal key decision makers, but I do want to talk about who some of those ones are around the provincial table. So no surprise that Premier Jason Kenney runs a very tight agenda with his cabinet and leads a lot of that discussion with his inner circle. That includes Minister of Finance and Treasury Board Travis Taze. Like we mentioned, right now there is some concerns about caucus unity, going back to that perceived lack of action on that Fair Deal panel, because what impacts downtown Calgary may impact rural Alberta a little different. But it's a new party learning the ropes and still learning how to operate under that big tent together. We did want to highlight some key changes in the Premier's office. A number of weeks ago, there was some cabinet shuffle changes, but also some staffing changes in the Premier's office too, which are really important. Larry Kohlmeyer is the new Principal Secretary for Premier Kenney. And it's important to know who the Principal Secretary is because they play a critical role in setting the strategic vision and agenda for the government. A little different than the Chief of Staff that would oversee the operations and execution of that plan. Larry, would be part of that inner circle that would help set the government's vision. So a great person to have on your radar for engagement as well too.
And Yanni, just on that, I would just say Larry has lived in Edmonton for a couple of decades, and he's fairly well known, certainly in the business circles. He's very accessible, and he is a very hard worker. He'll have meetings at 7 a.m. and 10 at night and on the weekends. So he's very accessible, and he is trying to be a good listener, is my experience with him. So again, just to reiterate, I think he's somebody that is worth getting to know if you haven't met him yet.
Great. So when it comes to applying that nonprofits and civil societies lens, there's a number of ministries that you're likely already engaging with or have on your radar. Culture and multiculturalism and status of women with Minister Leela here, community and social services with Minister Rajan Sani. Some groups are on the table may be interested in engaging with Josephine Pond, Ministers of Senior and Housing. And I see someone just mentioned Children's Services with Rebecca Schultz. So they all play a critical role, but I think what we often remind our clients is that the minister's office and the political staff and decision makers are really just a tip of a larger iceberg. And it's really important to consider the bottom of the iceberg, which is a lot bigger, but the public service and department staff and deputy ministers and ADMs, they play a critical role in helping advise the minister on how to approach upcoming issues. They have a lot of that institutional knowledge. While we may see ministries see a swap with cabinet shuffles quite often, that deputy minister and ADM really are that consistent voice around the table. So it's really important to engage with them as well too. What Alan mentioned, some of those pre-budget submissions and pre-budget engagement, that'll be led by the deputy minister in public service as well too. So for example, some of the deputy ministers for the ministers I just mentioned, Shannon Marchand with community and social services, Laura Pillapau with culture, and Susan Taylor with seniors. They all have about 20 to 30 years of public service experience with the government of Alberta. So great institutional knowledge and great resources to make use of as well too. And we'll include them in our breakdown of key people to engage with as well too. So no worries on that front. But back to the political side of the equation. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Alan.
Sorry to jump in, Yanni. I was just going to say, like every leader, there's sort of a smaller cohort of people that might be his closest advisors. And there's a handful of them with this leader. He's no different. But I do think that all governments, over the last 5 to 10 years have become more and more centralized. In part because of the need to control the message with social media and the 24-hour news cycle and those sorts of things. So they've all become more centralized, and this administration is no different. What I would say, though, with respect to your question about do ministers matter, I think that this premier has empowered his ministers to go out and do and fulfill their role as ministers, and I think their voices are heard around the cabinet table. What is clear is that the agenda is set centrally, but in terms of the day-to-day business of each ministry, I would argue that they all are empowered to go out and do their job and play their roles. And Leela and Rajan, I think, are two ministers that are well respected around the table and are understood to understand their ministry. So I do think they're important.
And speaking of important, I think it's also important to recognize the role of Capital Region Caucus. So, UCP, the UCP have a strong backbench and a lot of MLAs filling up that roster. And so you run into the issue of, if not everyone can be in cabinet, how do you keep some of those backbencher MLAs effective and busy and supporting their community? And a great way is with different caucuses as well too. So there's regional caucuses where they're broken up into Capital Region, North or South rural caucuses, or Calgary. I do want to flag Capital Region Caucus for this group specifically. And when I say Capital Region, I don't mean, Edmonton proper, but it really is that surrounding area as well too. So it's not just the one sole UCP MLA in Edmonton, but that surrounding region too. It's chaired by the MLA from Lac Santé and Parkland, Shane Getson. And they made some recent staffing changes in caucus too, where they're looking to really hit the reset button when it comes to stakeholder engagements, and are looking to hear about some of the local issues that are facing these groups. So another great area to engage with as well. And of course, the parliamentary secretaries too. The Alberta Francophone Parliamentary Secretary, Leila Goodrich. And, we mentioned Minister Sani in Community and Social Services. She's actually supported by the Parliamentary Secretary, Jeremy Nixon, who will be focusing on some of these issues on engagement as well too. So another great resource as well. So moving on to, so that lays out the political lay of the land for both the province and feds. I know we unpacked a lot there, but I think it's important to talk about how, that political landscape, how does that impact your engagements? We're entering critical times ahead for both the federal and provincial governments, working on pre-budget engagements before some very important budgets, while they simultaneously implement pandemic recovery plans. So there will be vital engagement opportunities over the next few months, and having the right tools and approach really will make all the difference. So wanting to talk a little bit about the landscape impacts on engagement and advocacy. As you said, it's important to not only understand what the lay of the land looks like, but how to take that step further and impact your engagements. So some important questions we often ask our clients heading into this is, presenting these issues, how does that impact some of your solutions? With government dealing with the pandemic recovery and response, they're still committed to engagement and consultation, but they've been, both the federal and provincial governments have been really clear that they wanted to be presented with solutions. So not only do you need to clarify the issue when you're reaching out to Capital Caucus or specific ministers or, Chrystia Freeland, you do need to present some solutions as well too. Continuing opportunities for engagement also means you need to determine who to meet with and when, and what the intent and goals are. So there's some tips and upcoming that can really help out with that.
Yanni, a really great question from Nancy she says, my experience with engaging government is that they often prefer to hear from volunteers, i.e. the board members, rather than the executive director and CEO. And she wonders what our thoughts are on that. And maybe I'll kick it off and if you want to jump in, but, in short, I would say there's truth to that for sure. In particular at the political level, right? They want to hear from the volunteers and those that are in their communities. But having said that, I would say that the departments, they want the facts, I guess, is the short of it. In particular, this premier is driven by the facts, and so he's often asking for the background material and the reports that will support a particular policy decision. So what I would say is, if you are going to send in your board members, just make sure that they're well informed, or and typically you'd go with them as the CEO or executive director. And then I would probably do a 1-2 approach to it, where you would meet before an elected official meeting. You would have a meeting with the department, because they're going to provide a briefing note in advance of your meeting. So you want to make sure that they've got the facts and an understanding of what you're going to say and why you're going to say it. And that will inform the briefing note, that then will inform the elected official, which should support the conversation with volunteers and board members in that meeting.
Yeah, and really just emphasizes the importance of that civil service and, the bottom of that iceberg, like we mentioned. Alan, another question here about how can we leverage our existing partnerships, specifically with corporations and business, to have conversations with the provincial government? Is that appropriate?
Yeah, I absolutely think it's appropriate. And I was sort of trying to refer to that earlier, that I think you need to maybe branch out to some of the less traditional approaches, right? And I think, this government is extremely business friendly. And so they already have a lot of relationships with the business community. So if you're able to tap in and leverage some of those, I think that would be really useful. So the short answer is absolutely.
Great.
And I agree with you, Gabriel, that the best practice is to go together. Yeah.
Okay. Just a quick note on the evolution of engagement, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, because we do have some great tips on best practices and common pitfalls, but it is important to note about just over the course of, we would say maybe the last 2 decades, how government relations engagements has seen an organic and natural restructure. No longer are we seeing the days of who where in past years, GR and engagements was simply based on connections. Someone could have a really trusty Rolodex that would have ministers and key decision makers' phone numbers, and they were really the sole proprietors of that information, and often seen as the gatekeepers, where you would keep them on retainer to maintain for the main purpose of access. But in today's evolving landscape, it's much more than just that access. Organizations are looking for a comprehensive government engagement strategy that includes, it does include government access and government relationship building, but there's also reputation management, issue and crisis communications, as well as an encompassing stakeholder engagement and advocacy strategy. So it's above and beyond where you can get some of those wraparound services in a strategy that will support the business plan of the organization. I will leave it there. Just a note on access to government, though. 20 years ago, you would need to have someone to help you set up a face-to-face meeting with the minister to ask a question, discuss an issue, or provide input on policy. Accessing decision makers was difficult when it was who was so important. But today, and I'm not suggesting we all do this right now, but we can all pull out our cell phones and tweet at the cabinet minister across the province or country with an issue, question, suggestion, and there is a chance that they will engage with us. So with the emergence of social media, all of a sudden, having that private cell number or office number for the minister is nice to have, but not a need to have. And we're just much more connected into our MLAs and MPs than we were, quite some time ago. So, Alan, I'll throw it to you for some effective engagement and common pitfalls, do's and don'ts.
Great. So I'll move fairly quickly. I think most of you, will know these, so I'll move through them. But if you have any questions, just let me know. But we generally say there's sort of 3 basic components to a good government relations strategy. And really is it start early, have those relationships early on at the public service level, at the elected level, and so that you know them before you need something. But it's also just to understand where they're heading and where you might fit. And the second piece is be part of the policy conversation. So, they are, the public service in particular are usually running at a Mach speed. They don't always have access to some of the expertise or information that you have. And so, if you've if you've commissioned a report or you have access to something that's a best practice from another jurisdiction, share that information with the public service. It helps you build a relationship, but it actually also helps you inform better policy. But I think that's a really good way to get the relationship going or deepened. The third part would be then to have specific strategies for specific issues. So basically, my point here is have a government relations strategy for a particular issue. So if you want a particular policy change, you're looking for funding for a particular initiative, then take the time to sit down and actually write out your strategy, and with a timeline and key messages, and then take the time to implement it. The other component to this is really around how you organize your organization around government relations, and coordinate. I can't say it enough, between your executive teams and your boards, for a couple of reasons. One, you want to utilize all your assets. So you might have board members that their neighbor is the deputy minister, or they know somebody. So utilize those relationships. But then to do that, you need consistent messaging. So make sure that everybody in your organization understands what your top 3 priorities are. Make sure they have key messages so that they can speak to it over the fence, or at a cocktail party, or in Safeway, or in a formal meeting. And we have worked with organizations that, I'll give you an example from maybe it's about almost 2 decades old, but it was an institution that it was a post-secondary, so they had multiple faculty, and then they had, of course, their administration. And they were struggling with why government wasn't funding any of their infrastructure asks. And so doing a little due diligence, what we realized is that they had very strong relationships across the board. There was a really strong list of all of their infrastructure asks. What was missing was what were the priorities. And in the absence of understanding what the priorities were, government wasn't funding any of it. So it just puts a fine point on, you need to be really clear on what your ask is and where your priorities lie. And then the third piece of that is around a central repository of intelligence. And people are kind of reticent to do that, right? For board members to report back and say, well, I spoke to so-and-so. But it's important. And it's important to write it down, because you'll often forget, the last time you spoke with Minister X, this is what you talked about, and this is the feedback you got. And if you can kind of hold that in a central repository, it just makes you more effective with your government relations. Next slide, please.
And before we move on, just a really great question from Brenda on advising over social media, and seems risky and potentially viewed as adversarial. For sure, thanks for allowing me to clarify. I definitely, if you do engage with government, you want to do it in a very strategic manner, and throwing a tweet out, it's hard to discuss and engage in 140 characters. But that was just an example to help demonstrate the evolution of government engagement, where previously there was a gatekeeper to some of these ministers, and now we all do have access to them, and they're much more open to engagement. So just an example, definitely not suggesting we begin tweeting as soon as we're done on this webinar. So Alana, I'll let you continue on with some common pitfalls.
Yeah, so this one I'll just touch on it briefly. The short of it is that it's okay to meet with, so I say build relationships before you need anything. But what I'll also say though is don't, I guess, be clear on why you're meeting is the short of it. So I've had clients who have gone into government and they give a really good pitch about who they are, and then the government will sit back and say, well, what do you need from me? And so that was sort of on their mind throughout the course of the meeting. So all I would say is if it is just a relationship building, just be clear up front. I don't need anything. I want to know how I can help you. Here's what we do. Here's our area of policy expertise. Here's what we're seeing and hearing. And that's all we want to share with you. And if you do have an ask, then again, be clear right out of the gate that you're here because you want to talk about a particular issue and you're hoping to get their help. So again, it's just about we're just being really clear and upfront. And the second is around knowing your audience, and that's also in understanding their environment. So, even though, the government is talking about a fiscal reckoning, it doesn't mean you can't go in and ask for money, but you got to do it in a way that recognizes the situation, right? So I have heard governments say they seem disconnected from, the fiscal reality. And so I think sometimes it's just acknowledging what the fiscal reality is and some of the challenges are. But within that context, you think this should be a funding priority, and here is why. And sometimes it just takes that extra 30 seconds to give it the context to be heard in a different light. And yeah, so the other piece was around escalation. And, we get asked this a lot. The government's taking too long. We don't feel like they're hearing us. We're going to go directly to the opposition. And all of that is, all I would say on this is there's likely a time when you're going to feel like escalation is required, and that might very well be. But I would just say, as part of your government relations strategy, you should map out what the triggers are for escalation and the risks associated with that. So, is it worth it to maybe win the battle, but ultimately you think you might lose the war because you've scorched too much earth, right? So it's just making sure that you're really purposeful and you've thought that through before you've done it. And that's it for me, Yanni, on that.
Great, and just building off of that point, I think some great questions that you can ask yourself as an organization when it comes to engagement escalation are here. So, what is the best time to approach escalation as part of your strategy? Having some of those touch points to say, if we haven't reached this goal by, this specific date, is it time to turn up the heat or turn up the volume? Another great question is how far is too far? Like Alan mentioned, scorching earth could be great for winning the battle, but you lose the war. And we've absolutely seen organizations and groups over the course of an afternoon just undo years of relationship building because it took escalation too far. So having a clear line in the sand on how far is too far for your escalation efforts.
Great. And I'm going to just fly through my, did you have one more? Sorry, Yanni.
No, we can move on. I'll move through the GR, using a GR firm fairly quickly, and then Alana, I'll let you kickstart the conversation on focusing priorities. But, we talked a lot about framing your messaging, how to escalate issues, how to gather a group to move forward on shared priorities. So groups may need the services of a GR firm, especially when it comes to things like, escalation and wanting to do that properly or engage opposition properly. So a GR and advocacy firm can help you do that. Before you do that, though, some pre-work needs to be done to answer some of these questions that we've identified here. So just understanding what services are available to you and what you need. Do you need wraparound services that include advocacy, comms and PR, stakeholder engagements in management, or a hybrid of those services? Or do you simply need a firm to identify who to engage with at the political level? Secondly, the right time to engage with a firm is really important. Engaging early can ensure a firm with a background in refining priorities can provide insight into your focus. And just understanding that the different types of firms out there and what best suits your needs. Doing your homework and due diligence will go a long way. Ask the potential firm some really tough questions in advance. Put them through don't be afraid to grill them and treat it like a job interview because it'll make all the difference down the road. So we'll move on to focusing priorities. And Alana, I'll let you take it from there.
Sure. So maybe flip to understanding the agenda from Yanni. And I'll just briefly touch on this so we can open it up to questions. I think I've touched on this, just understanding your audience. What I wanted to comment on was this notion of being political and not partisan. And as I said earlier, it's okay to engage all sides. And in fact, I think that's good to do. Just know the agenda of all the sides that you're meeting with. And, just do your best to stay out of partisan fights and positioning, right? And you guys, will all know how to do that. But, sometimes you just inadvertently end up in one, and then you got to figure out how to extricate yourself. And, we see it probably more in the private sector, where businesses might be more overt in aligning themselves to one side or the other. But, more often than not, that tends to come back and bite you. So I would just my approach tends to be more around sharing, treating all electeds as electeds and, understanding their politics, but that doesn't mean you have to be partisan. It just means that you need to be politically savvy. And, articulating your, as I said, your message similarly to all sides. And the other sort of piece on that, sorry, I'm just trying to find my note, so this was my other comment, was just, my view is regardless of the ideology coming in, all governments become government, which means, in my mind, that they all want to become, they all want to get reelected, right? And they all have a duty to represent all people. So, even if you think that from an ideological perspective, you may not fit, I think, just approaching it from the government of the day perspective might help you find a path forward in communicating with them. And I'll leave it there, Yanni.
Great, that's a really great point. And I think that leads us into language alignment, which I'll just spend a brief moment on before we talk about priorities and open up for some questions. But on the note of being political, nonpartisan, identifying your target audience for targeted messages is important, and understanding some of the language they use to find that alignment. So, for example, phrases like compassionate cuts, austerity measures, family values mean different things to different groups on the political spectrum. So just take that into consideration when you are fleshing out some of your language alignments. There are lots of books and materials on this issue. They may also be a little left-leaning or a little right-leaning too. So just back to that point on being political and being politically savvy, and not taking a dive into the partisan weeds. But as we talked about using a GR or advocacy firm, this is definitely one of the key service deliveries that could serve an organization when you are fleshing out some of those key messages. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch on priority developments and leave you with 3 questions that, we've seen a lot. They seem simple and they seem easy, but we've seen a lot of organizations and boards and executive teams struggle as they try to flesh out their priorities before they start, picking up the phone to reach out to some of these key government decision makers. So the first is understanding government's priorities. Where are their areas of alignment? And it's a tough conversation to say, this priority may be very important to us, but at the moment there just is absolutely no alignment with this government, and we will not find success. And it's a tough conversation, but it's really helps frame all of your engagement efforts right off the bat. Second one, especially really important during this pre-budget submissions and pre-budget engagements, is if you are asking for funding, can some of the funding be spread out over a period of time where it will impact government's bottom line a little less, or does it need to be all in this budget cycle? It's a really important question to consider. And like Alan said, it really demonstrates that you do have a grasp and do have a strong understanding of the current fiscal reality and fiscal climate facing the province. And then another really important question for this group is, does this priority need to be taken on as an individual or as a sector approach? More voices singing from the same song sheet really amplify the message. There are benefits to it, but then there are drawbacks on ensuring that there is alignment and groups don't break off into their own tangents. Or does this need to be an individual approach where a sole organization will take it on themselves? So 3 questions that we'll leave you with for consideration to help start the conversation as you enter into some of these, really vital engagement periods on the pre-budget submission. So with that, and just looking at the time, I do want to open up the floor to any additional questions on either anything we've said or didn't say or haven't covered. We definitely welcome any conversations or questions on that front. Okay, I'm not seeing any come through. There was an earlier question on some, services that or mail lists that can be helpful or useful for giving you a breakdown of, what government is doing. We did mention we wish our email addresses, so feel free to stay connected with future questions with Alan or I. We'll also circulate that as well too afterwards. And then when it comes to a breakdown of what government is doing in the House, we do have the weekly impact report. So it's a weekly publication that does a roundup of government key decisions, a bit of analysis on what that means for stakeholders, as well as legislative bills and debates too. It's a really comprehensive document that we pulled together. So if you are interested in that, we are offering up some trials subscription offers as well too. So feel free to contact me on that. I do see a question about this government appears to be very socially conservative. Is that a fair comment? So Alan, do you want to take that one on first?
You know, I think certainly there's a segment of the caucus that is more socially conservative, no doubt about it, and they tend to be more of the rural, you know, in particular in southern Alberta. I think that is, you know, one of the challenges of sort of the notion of a big tent party and also, you know, such a large number of seats. So it's a challenge, I think, for this administration. And, you know, we saw it back even in the Ralph Klein era, when you get sort of a diversity around the political spectrum, right? So if you have people on one end and people on the other, you know, just trying to find the right balance. I think that's exactly what they deal with today. I don't know how large the cohort is, but I think it's definitely there. I think that's fair.
And I see Harry's agreeing with that question, saying we need strategies for dealing with comments on intersectionality as kooky economic theories. So yeah, like Alan said, definitely understand some of the challenges, but staying focused on, you know, like we said, the public service is a great place to start with as well, where they pass up a lot of those briefing notes and suggestions to the elected officials. So a great place to start there as well.
I think it's probably worth noting too that the Premier had said during the election campaign that, you know, and maybe this is in part why they're so strictly focused and had been until COVID on their election platform, is that, you know, his view was that some of the more divisive issues were not ones that he intended on touching while in government, and that his focus would be predominantly on economic policy, for what that's worth.
Okay, so if you have no more questions, I'm sure you will all agree with me. This session has been highly informative and given us all some great strategies where we can take forward. So if you would like to join me in sort of a virtual appreciation of Jonathan and Ilan, I think that this has really given us some good foundations as we start to move forward. I also wanted to mention that there has been some work, to Ilan's point, around having a coordinated platform that CCVO has been leading for the province, and they have released their document that has recommendations in it on the Alberta Community Advantage, and ABNN is working with CCVO currently to look at how, at a sector level, we may advance some of those recommendations and are there other recommendations. So watch out for information on that as we move forward in that space. We will be sending out a mini survey just to see whether you found it helpful. And thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.